Mara Delaney never saw the car that would end her life, but in the days leading up to her death, she knew someone was watching. The fearless Seattle activist had built her reputation exposing corruption and corporate pollution, yet on a quiet August night, her voice was silenced in what first appeared to be a road rage attack. As detectives dug deeper, the line between coincidence and conspiracy began to blur, revealing a truth far darker than anyone imagined. Mara Delaney had become a familiar face in Seattle's activist circles, a young woman who seemed to carry an endless amount of energy wherever she went. She was 29, with a quiet confidence that made people listen even when she spoke softly. Her activism wasn't born from politics or personal ambition. It started years earlier when a toxic spill near her college campus had poisoned a local creek. Seeing fish floating lifeless in the water had changed her. She decided then that silence was just another kind of harm. Over time, her passion grew into purpose and her purpose into movement. By 2023, Mara had become one of the city's most recognized environmental advocates. Her days were packed with meetings, interviews, and public talks, and her nights were often spent drafting petitions or helping community groups write proposals. Her social media pages reflected her determination. There were photos of beach cleanups, tree planting drives, and marches across the downtown streets with handmade banners fluttering in the wind. She wasn't radical in her tone, but she was relentless in her pursuit of truth. That persistence drew both admiration and anger. Some saw her as a beacon for change, while others viewed her as a threat to their comfort and profits. Seattle was proud of its progressive image, but underneath the city's green reputation were power struggles, money trails, and quiet deals made behind closed doors. Mara had begun poking into those shadows. She recently started questioning the environmental safety records of a few local construction companies' projects that promised eco-friendly designs but had alarming waste management practices. When she wrote about them online, her posts gathered attention quickly. Some of the names she mentioned had deep political connections, and soon she started receiving messages warning her to choose her battles wisely. She ignored them at first, assuming they were empty threats. Despite the pressure, Mara kept going. Her friends sometimes worried about her long hours and fearless attitude. She laughed it off, saying that activism was never meant to be comfortable. Her boyfriend remembered her saying that change never comes from playing it safe. She carried a notebook everywhere she went, filled with scribbles about meetings, phone numbers, and random ideas for her next campaign. Among those notes were hints of a larger story she'd been chasing, something about a company that had been dumping industrial waste near a protected wetland north of the city. By early August, Mara had gathered enough evidence to take her findings to the press. She even hinted online that she would be releasing something important soon. Her followers cheered her on, unaware of the growing tension beneath the surface. She was restless that week, not out of fear but out of excitement, as though she was standing on the edge of something big. She didn't know that the same determination that had made her admired also made her a target. The last week of her life looked ordinary, from the outside morning coffee at her favorite cafe, a quick stop at her office downtown, and an evening meeting with volunteers. But behind her bright smile, there was a quiet unease. She had mentioned to one of her colleagues that she felt someone had been following her car on a few occasions. She tried to dismiss it as paranoia, but the thought lingered. Seattle's streets, once familiar and welcoming, had started to feel different, heavier somehow. When Friday, August 12th, arrived, it felt like any other day in the city. The sun had dipped behind the skyline, and traffic crawled through the main roads. Mara left her office late, carrying her laptop and a folder of documents she planned to review over the weekend. She waved goodbye to a friend and walked toward her car parked along Aurora Avenue. It would be the last time anyone saw her alive. At 9:47 p.m., the Seattle Police Department received a call that shattered the stillness of a late summer night. Drivers along Aurora Avenue reported hearing a loud pop, followed by the sound of a car swerving violently toward the shoulder. Some thought it was a tire blowout, others said it sounded unmistakably like a gunshot. When officers arrived minutes later, they found a white hybrid sedan stopped at an angle, headlights still glowing weakly through the drizzle. Inside, behind shattered glass and a spiderweb of cracks on the driver's side window, sat Mara Delaney. She was motionless, her seatbelt locked tight across her chest. A single bullet hole marked the driver's window. The scene looked both sudden and deliberate. Paramedics worked quickly, but the injury was fatal. By the time she reached Harborview Medical Center, she had no pulse. Within an hour, doctors confirmed what the first responders already knew: Mara Delaney was dead. News of the incident spread fast across police radios. Within an hour, it was on social media. Prominent Seattle activist shot in apparent road rage attack. It seemed senseless, tragic, and random, the kind of headline that leaves more questions than answers. Witnesses told police they had seen two cars speeding down Aurora moments before the shooting. One was a white sedan, later confirmed as Mara's. The other was a dark-colored vehicle, possibly a black or navy blue sedan with tinted windows. The drivers appeared to have exchanged aggressive maneuvers, swerving in and out of lanes before the second car abruptly pulled alongside Mara's. Then came the gunshot. The second car sped away, disappearing into the network of roads leading north out of the city. Investigators began combing through the stretch of highway for evidence. They found fragments of glass, a single shell casing lodged near the guardrail, and faint tire marks where Mara's car had drifted to a stop. Traffic cameras in that area were notoriously unreliable, with several out of order due to ongoing maintenance. Detectives were frustrated by the lack of immediate visual evidence. The only lead was the vague description of the dark sedan. The initial theory was simple: a case of road rage that turned deadly. Maybe a confrontation between strangers, a reckless argument that escalated in a moment of rage. But as officers began to piece together Mara's background, that explanation started to feel incomplete. Her name was known citywide, and her activism had earned her both admiration and enemies. This wasn't just any victim, it was a woman who had spent years challenging corporations and city leaders alike. The randomness of it all seemed coincidental. The investigation expanded quickly. Detectives requested nearby surveillance footage from gas stations, businesses, and residential cameras along the route Mara had taken that night. They tracked her movements through phone data, reconstructing her final hours. She had left a meeting with volunteers shortly after 9 o'clock p.m. and stopped briefly at a convenience store to refuel. Security footage there showed her calm, smiling, and unaware of anyone following her. 15 minutes later, she was gone. By morning, the story dominated local news. Candlelight vigils were already being planned, and community members demanded justice. Her friends flooded social media with tributes describing her as fearless and selfless. Reporters gathered outside police headquarters, pushing for details that detectives didn't yet have. The pressure was immense, and rumors spread faster than facts. Inside the department, officers worked around the clock, following up on every lead. But the darker question hung in the air: was this truly a random act of violence, or had someone decided to silence her for good? For now, there was only a car that vanished into the night, a single bullet, and a city struggling to understand why one of its brightest voices had been so suddenly and violently taken away. Detectives began by tracing every step Mara had taken in the days before her death. They went through her phone records, her emails, and her social media accounts. What started as a straightforward homicide case quickly turned into a tangled web of connections that didn't quite fit the profile of a random road rage attack. Her messages revealed that in the week leading up to her death, she had received several anonymous texts warning her to stop digging and think about her safety. The numbers were untraceable, routed through disposable online services. The tone of the messages wasn't impulsive or angry, it was controlled, almost professional. Investigators also discovered that Mara had recently been investigating a construction company called North Bridge Developments. The firm had contracts with the city for multiple projects, including a new waterfront redevelopment. On paper, North Bridge promoted itself as sustainable and community-driven. But Mara's private notes, found on her laptop, suggested otherwise. She had uncovered evidence of illegal dumping of chemical waste into nearby wetlands land protected under state environmental laws. Her notes also referenced meetings she believed were happening between company executives and a private security firm that specialized in public relations protection. Police began looking into whether the road rage narrative was just a cover for something planned. Surveillance footage from a gas station a few blocks from the shooting scene offered a critical clue. It showed Mara's car pulling into the lot briefly at 9:33 p.m., just minutes before her death. A dark sedan appeared behind her, idling at a distance. When Mara drove away, the sedan followed. Investigators enhanced the footage and identified part of a license plate number. It was the first real lead they had. Meanwhile, public reaction was growing more intense. Protests erupted downtown, with crowds chanting for justice and transparency. People who had worked with Mara claimed she'd told them she was being watched. One friend mentioned that Mara had planned to leak her findings to a local journalist within days. The more police learned, the more it seemed her death was far from accidental. Detectives traced the partial plate to several possible vehicles, one of which belonged to a private security consultant named Evan Royce. His company, Royce Tactical Solutions, had been subcontracted by North Bridge Developments for site safety management. On the surface, it looked like routine business, but emails uncovered later hinted at a deeper involvement. They contained discussions about monitoring environmental agitators, a term used for activists who interfered with construction operations. Mara's name appeared in one of those exchanges. When officers visited Evan's home to question him, he denied knowing Mara personally. He claimed he was home the night of the shooting. Yet his cell phone records placed him near Aurora Avenue around the same time Mara was killed. Detectives couldn't arrest him without stronger evidence, but suspicions grew. The case took on new urgency. The narrative of a random road rage incident was crumbling under the weight of digital clues and corporate ties. Every detail pointed toward deliberate targeting, but proving it was another matter entirely. Behind the scenes, some investigators began to worry that they were stepping into political territory. North Bridge Developments was a powerful company with deep connections to City Hall. Questions were being raised not only about who killed Mara Delaney, but also about how far those in power were willing to go to keep certain truths buried. By the end of the third week, detectives had enough circumstantial evidence to shift their focus entirely. The hunt for a mysterious, angry driver was over. What lay ahead was something far more calculated: a quiet war between truth and control, and a young activist caught in the middle of it. 3 weeks after the shooting, the investigation reached a turning point. For days, detectives had sifted through footage, digital records, and hours of surveillance that seemed to lead nowhere. Then, a traffic camera 2 miles north of the shooting scene captured a faint glimpse of a black sedan turning onto a quiet residential street just minutes after Mara's car had come to a stop. The timestamp matched almost exactly. The license plate, once enhanced, confirmed what investigators had begun to suspect. The car belonged to Evan Royce. Evan was a 33-year-old security consultant with a reputation for being meticulous and reserved. He ran a small firm that provided private surveillance and risk assessment services to corporate clients. He had no criminal record, paid his taxes on time, and lived in a modern townhouse in Ballard. On the surface, he looked like any other professional. But buried within his company's contracts were layers of work done for organizations connected to controversial projects, ones that had drawn protests from environmental groups. Including Mara's, his firm had recently been subcontracted by North Bridge Developments to handle what they called public safety coordination. When detectives brought him in for questioning, Evan remained calm. He admitted to driving near Aurora Avenue that night but claimed it was a coincidence. He said he had been returning from a client meeting on the north side of the city. His voice stayed steady as he answered every question, but the more he spoke, the more inconsistencies appeared. He couldn't recall the name of the client he supposedly met, nor could he provide proof of the meeting. His story began to crumble under scrutiny. A search warrant for his house and office uncovered files that deepened the mystery. Among them were images of local activists taken from public events and social media pages. Most had notes attached, names, locations, and patterns of behavior. One folder, deleted but recovered by forensic analysts, contained a series of photographs of Mara Delaney. Some were taken from a distance outside her apartment building, others during protests she had attended. Each image was tagged with time and location stamps. Despite the disturbing discovery, there was still no direct evidence tying Evan to the shooting. The gun used was never found. Ballistics couldn't identify a weapon, and there were no fingerprints on the shell casing recovered at the scene. The prosecution's case was strong on motive but weak on proof. As the investigation dragged on, media attention intensified. Reporters camped outside the police department and Evan's neighborhood. Conspiracy theories exploded online. Some claimed Mara had been silenced for uncovering corruption, while others said she'd been the victim of an unstable stranger. The truth remained just out of reach, buried under speculation. Then, unexpectedly, a friend of Mara's came forward. She said Mara had given her a small USB drive a week before her death, asking her to hold on to it in case something happened. The friend hadn't looked at it, assuming it was just backup work. Now, she handed it over to detectives. The contents of that drive would rewrite the case completely. Inside were folders of emails, documents, and correspondence between Northbridge executives, city officials, and Royce Tactical Solutions. They discussed activists by name and referenced operations to monitor and deter disruptive behavior. Some of the language was vague, but one exchange stood out: a message chain written the same day Mara was killed. It referenced a planned intercept intended to discourage exposure. The words were chillingly deliberate. Detectives knew they had crossed from suspicion into something undeniable. The pattern was clear. Mara hadn't been the victim of a random act of road rage. She had been watched, followed, and silenced. The question that now haunted investigators wasn't who pulled the trigger, but how many people knew it would happen. The discovery of the USB drive shifted the entire course of the investigation. For months, detectives had been piecing together fragments of a story that never quite fit. Now, with the files in hand, the picture grew painfully clear. The emails showed a direct connection between Northbridge Developments, several city officials, and Evan Royce's security company. The documents described meetings where activist interference was discussed as a threat to project deadlines and profits. Within those threads were references to surveillance strategies, tracking movements, and controlling narratives in the media. One exchange stood out above the rest, a message chain time-stamped just hours before Mara's death. It mentioned a planned intercept to prevent data release. The phrasing was cold, stripped of emotion, but its meaning was unmistakable. Investigators began cross-checking the details with phone records and GPS data. Evan's phone had pinged near the area of the shooting at the exact time of the attack, despite his earlier claim that he was home. His vehicle's onboard navigation system, once recovered, confirmed he had driven along Aurora Avenue that night. It was the missing link detectives had been searching for. Within days, they obtained a warrant for his arrest. Evan was taken into custody without resistance. His expression remained calm, almost detached, as officers read him his rights. The trial that followed captivated the city. Every day, the courthouse steps filled with protesters holding signs demanding justice for Mara. Reporters swarmed the entrance, and television crews broadcast updates around the clock. Inside the courtroom, the mood was tense. The prosecution argued that Evan's actions were not spontaneous but calculated. They presented the emails, the surveillance photos, and expert testimony about the deleted files on his computer. The defense countered that the messages were being misinterpreted, claiming the intercept referred only to a planned meeting meant to talk Mara out of publishing her findings. They said the shooting was an accident, the result of a confrontation that escalated too quickly. Weeks of testimony followed, with every detail dissected in public view. Friends of Mara spoke about her fearlessness and her growing anxiety in the days before her death. Detectives described the painstaking process that led them to the truth. Evan himself took the stand, maintaining that he had never meant for anyone to get hurt. But his story unraveled under cross-examination. The jury listened in silence as the prosecution displayed the final email exchange proof that Mara's name had been specifically mentioned in connection to the intercept. When the verdict was finally read, the courtroom was silent. Evan Royce was found guilty of second-degree murder and conspiracy to obstruct justice. The sentence was life in prison. Northbridge Developments faced federal investigations, and several city officials resigned under mounting public pressure. The scandal rippled far beyond Seattle, sparking national debates about corruption, environmental accountability, and the dangers faced by activists who challenge power. In the months that followed, Seattle's streets bore reminders of Mara's legacy. Murals appeared across the city, painted with her image and the words "Truth Doesn't Die." Each year, on the anniversary of her death, crowds gathered along Aurora Avenue to hold a vigil at the spot where her car had come to rest. People brought candles, flowers, and signs demanding transparency. The atmosphere was quiet but resolute, filled with the same spirit that had driven Mara throughout her life. Her story became more than a case or a headline, it became a symbol. What began as a tragic night on a rain-slicked highway ended as a turning point for a city forced to confront its own reflection. Mara Delaney's fight for accountability lived on through those who picked up where she left off, determined that her voice, once silenced, would never fade from Seattle's conscience again.